Hello, this is Martin Carcasson. I'm an associate professor of communication studies here at Colorado State University and the founder and the director of the CSU Center for Public Deliberation. I'm putting this video together primarily for the Kettering Foundations Center for Public Life program, but I also helped for it to be just a general resource that people can use to kind of hear about organizations like the Center for Public Deliberation and the impact they can kind of make on local communities. Essentially what I'll be covering in this video is what I do in the first 2 days of my classes with my student facilitators, where I'm just kind of outlining the purpose of the CPD and kind of the main theory behind it. So I'm just going to be sharing my screen here. I'm going to try to keep this overall video under an hour, which is going to be a little compressed, and so I'll probably fly through some of the slides without too much detail. But I'm also happy, anyone who wants to email or give me a call to kind of dig into a little bit more and send more resources about any of the specific things that we cover. So basically the presentation I'll be giving is what sort of talk does democracy need? It's a call for deliberative engagement, a call for the work that these Centers for Public Life or the CPD kind of focuses on. To tell you a little bit more about me and the Center for Public Deliberation, again, I started about 10 years ago. It serves as an impartial resource for the Northern Colorado community. Here's an example of kind of one of the meetings we won. We work with a city, we work with a school district, we work with different community organizations like United Way to host events. And 100 people might show up, and we have the capacity with the students that I work with to split those 100 people up into lots of small groups. The students, the two students on the left are mine, one facilitating, one note-taking, are not only just trained generally on deliberative facilitation and small group communication, but also trained specifically for that event. So each event we develop a specific process to engage the community to talk about issues in a much deeper way. And a lot of this presentation today will be why we think that's important and some of the how on how we do that. So here are just some of the topics that we've focused on in the last few years that we've been working with. Again, most of these topics are coming to us from the community now that we've been established, asking us to help with various topics as we kind of go through. We end up doing about 4 or 5 a semester, but we are kind of a more advanced program that's been doing this kind of for a while. A lot of the centers might only have 1 or 2 a semester that they're kind of working on as they go through. So the structure of the presentation I'm giving today is going to focus on these 3 questions. What is the nature of the problems we are facing? Talking about wicked problems, and a lot of the theory behind this is that the type of problems that we're dealing with kind of call for a different way of talking that we're not getting nationally in our community. So the second question, what kind of communication or engagement processes help us address those problems, are going to look first kind of at the 2 dominant ways of talk, which I talk about expert and adversarial, and the why they don't work well with wicked problems, and why we need to develop kind of more capacity for deliberative engagement. And then last, we'll talk a little bit about it, and then how do we do that? How do we build capacity? And in particular, obviously, what is the role of Centers for Public Life within that? So starting with the first question, what is the nature of problems? We look at this distinction between tame and wicked problems, and this was initially developed by Ritter and Weber, really kind of taking just the last few years. The term wicked problem has really been kind of, we've been hearing a lot more about it, a lot of different research on it. But the quick kind of main distinction, Ritter and Weber were engineers, trained as engineers in college, and then went to work for municipalities. And they found out pretty quickly that the kind of problems they were asked to solve in cities were very different than the kind of problems they were trying to train to solve. So they felt they were trained to solve tame problems, which can be very difficult problems, but they are technical problems that have a solution, right? Smart people in the same room can automatically kind of converge onto a solution. So if there is kind of one solution out there, how you measure different solutions against each other is really to look at efficiency. How can we solve that problem with the kind of fewest resources in terms of money and time and those type of things? But the kind of problems they were dealing with in the cities, they found pretty quickly didn't have these aspects, right? They called them wicked problems. And in the main, I'm going to talk about 5 kind of key points on wicked problems. But the first one is probably the most important one, which is that wicked problems inherently involve these competing underlying values and paradoxes or trade-offs or tensions that can't be resolved by science. And at the heart of the issue, and I think with most of the issues that CPD takes on, that's really what we're looking at is what are the underlying kind of values that are really kind of important to this issue that people aren't kind of seeing very clearly, so people kind of end up talking past each other. So a couple examples here. This is one of the issues that we worked on a few years ago here in Fort Collins. Water, like most of the West, is scarce sometimes in Fort Collins. We're right next to the mountains, so we actually get a lot of water in May and June when all the snow melts and kind of runs on by. But the rest of the year, we're pretty arid. But for the last 100 years, we've built up kind of an agricultural community, using a lot of reservoirs and using irrigation ditches, and capturing a lot of that water, and also bringing some more water over from Western Slope. But we're also a great place to live, and we're growing like crazy, and there's a lot of demand on the water there. Plus, in the last 100 years, we've learned a lot more about rivers and the health of the river, and how much water we need to leave in the river. And all these things are kind of coming together to kind of create a conflict. So we are asked by the Community Foundation here in Northern Colorado, and working with the CSU Water Institute, to help our community have better conversations about water. And as we started getting that issue, we started doing a lot of background research, and really, how do people talk about water? And these are 9 things, just again, we call this a wicked problem slide, 9 kind of underlining things that people care about when they talk about water, or they argue about water. And 2 kind of important theoretical points of looking at a slide like this. One is taking one at a time. These are all just inherently good things. There's nothing bad with these, right? The wickedness of the problem is not that there's people that have bad values or want bad wants. The wickedness is within the problem rather than the people. So one at a time, these are all good things. But the second key point is they don't fit well together. The more we focus on one of these boxes, there's an inherent kind of natural tensions with some of the other boxes. The problem, as we'll get to, is most of our dominant kind of public conversation tends to focus within individual boxes. Adversaries and advocates are going to frame things within a box of this is what's important, and therefore kind of implying that people that disagree with them think that one thing is less important, or dismiss that thing. In the same way, experts tend to focus on one box. An expert, by definition, they know a whole bunch about a little bit, right? So too often the conversation is kind of disconnected in a sense. The real conversation we need to have is struggling between the boxes. How do we prioritize these boxes? How do we kind of work to kind of transcend the tensions and get create win-win situations and things like that, right? Another kind of example to play with, this is actually the preamble of the Constitution, a quick little exercise I often do live with audiences. Within that preamble, there's 5 kind of dominant values that jump out at you. If we translate those values into a little bit more common terms, I'll make the argument that here are 5 dominant American values: justice, security or safety, equality, freedom for us, and freedom for future generations. So I can't do this online, but I often kind of, with my keypads, kind of ask this question of audiences: which of these are most important to you? Because if we first ask, taking one at a time, we all agree. If your choice is between justice or injustice, everyone picks justice. If your justice is between security and insecurity or danger, everyone's going to pick security, and on down. But the question is, what happens when you have to pick one, right? Which one's your trump? Which one's most important to you? These are actually the results from the last time when I did this live with the Kettering Center for Public Life program. And you see every single one of those values was picked by at least 2 people in the room as the most important to them, right? Or even the more difficult question is which is least important to you? Which one are you most willing to give up? Which one, if push comes to shove? And once again, every single one of them was picked by at least one person. So in that room, you had lots of people that their most important value was someone else's least important value, and vice versa. It seems like there's a lot of conflict. But again, if we just start off and take them one by one, every single one of them was supported by the entire group. And this kind of comes from the work of Chaim Perlman, a philosopher, that really talks about that we all actually have the same values. But what makes us different is how we rank those values. And when those values are in competition with each other, with the decision that we need to make, some of us are going to pick kind of different ways. And again, that's the conversation we need to have. But we tend not to have that because it's natural human nature, and it's very strategically useful to frame things more narrowly, to say that there's one value element, to try to frame things as if you're the one with values and your opponents are the ones without values that reject an important value versus focusing on a different values, right? Now, the reason ranking them become important is because there are natural tensions between them. If you look at those values, that we can't just focus on one without perhaps losing some of the other. Not automatic kind of zero sum that they're completely opposed, but there generally tend to be tensions. So freedom versus equality, particularly with economic issues, the more freedom in a capitalistic system, we tend to have more inequality. If we want equality, we tend to have to violate freedom. Or our freedom versus freedom of future generations is a key tension kind of with environmental movements. Do we need to curtail the freedoms that we have now to make sure we still have those freedoms later? Freedom versus security is a key tension every time we go to the airport, and kind of struggling with that. And then justice is a special case. Justice and fairness, there's a lot of new research coming out, and there's a lot of old research that, justice has been a topic for many years. But justice is almost a tension within itself. That justice is getting exactly what you deserve, no more, no less. So you have lots of different, across the political spectrum that kind of claim justice, but often claim it in very different ways. Sometimes justice is tied to equality and equity. Sometimes justice is tied to merit, and that's some, tied to supporting inequality, that those that work harder should be rewarded more. Now, here are just some of the other kind of key overlying tensions that come out in a lot of the work that we do. In a lot of the deliberative perspective and kind of looking things through the wicked problems lens really tends to focus on, okay, what are the underlying tensions that are often unstated, and how do we identify those, how do we put those on the table, and how do we help people kind of work through them? Because the back end of working through them is where you really get some innovative solutions and some sustainable kind of support for some important actions kind of moving forward. So here are just some examples. I'm not going to walk through all these, but just, a lot of the topics that we deal with, we like to do this underlining values. What are the different things? And again, the two main points are taking one at a time. Each of these things is a good thing, but the heart of the issue is really focusing on some of these values or some of these interests are inherently kind of go against some of the others. And trying to find the right balance and the way to negotiate those tensions become the important part. A very simple one of looking at healthcare. Of those tensions coming out, which will be a bigger and bigger conversation these years. Capitalism itself can be seen as a wicked problem in terms of the 3 points of the triple bottom line. Pitchers are dealing with a wicked problem all the time when you're asking them to kind of do work. We did a project on parking here at CSU, and parking at first seemed like it'd be a really benign kind of subject, but it was amazing how value laden it was once we started going through some of these surveys and how people kind of looked at something like a parking issue. We've done lots of stuff with K-12. You have lots of interesting tensions kind of coming out with that. And again, everyone coming from a good place and from an important place and trying to frame things with a key value as the heart of it. But the tensions underlining them come out pretty clearly. Right? So that was the first point, probably the most important point of this overall presentation, is that mindset of what are the underlying values, what are the underlying tensions that we really need to kind of get to understand. Second point, which I won't spend as much time on, is just the basic notion that wicked problems are systemic. You don't solve a wicked problem. Solutions can certainly improve the situation, can find better ways of balancing the values, can find ways of transcending them. But no matter what, you're never going to solve a wicked problem. Communities are going to treat them better or worse. And that's part of it. Like if you just focus on one value and you kind of put the blinders on, you can maybe move the needle on that one value, but you're going to have a lot of other unintended consequences. So deliberative practitioners in particular need to step back and try to see the bigger picture, see that connection, and working with attention is kind of help you do that. Third kind of key point is optimal solutions to wicked problems require adaptive changes. What adaptive changes are behavioral changes. It means people need to be involved. So for a lot of the issues, really understanding the multiple stakeholders and what their role can be becomes a key part of the conversation. We're not going to improve schools just by experts in a room finding out the best way to run a school and kind of sending out a memo. But students have to be involved, parents have to be involved, obviously teachers have to be involved, and beyond that, because they each have a piece in that. And we know kind of from history that people don't change behavior kind of based on research or based on a dictate from above. They change their behavior based on being part of the conversation and taking ownership of actions kind of moving forward. So how do we create the capacity for those kind of conversations? So this is one of the slides that we use to kind of talk about the notion of democratic governance, that when we're looking at wicked problems, actions can come from multiple levels. So at the top, yes, policy change might be an important. That's often a big focus of a lot of kind of policy issues or just community discussions. And at the bottom, individual actions and attitudes and skills can kind of change. But in between, there's a lot of work of cross-sector collaboration, of the role of businesses, the role of nonprofits, the role of networks and coalitions. So a lot of the work that we do in deliberation, the role of religious institutions, become how do we kind of coordinate this? How do we all work together? How do we all see our piece kind of moving forward? And fourth, addressing wicked problems, therefore, to work all these stakeholders together requires effective collaboration and communication. in probably one of the biggest points that we're making is with tough issues, we primarily get the like-minded working together, and we get a lot of polarization, which is so evident in particularly in our national politics. And so a wicked problem really calls for this high-level quality communication, and we're often getting just the opposite in most of our issues. So we need to kind of work together versus screaming at each other and having that polarized communication that poisons so many things. And particularly in our local community, we can really work to kind of turn that around. A lot of deliberation kind of requires this collaboration, this communication across at least these three areas. We need the experts, we need to get information, we need the institutional decision makers that have the broader level levers of change, but we also need the public. If we're going to be democratic, the public has to have a key role. So a lot of the work that we do is to try to bring these kind of three worlds together in productive ways. And last, wicked problems require creativity and innovation and imagination. And this is kind of one of the exciting things about our work is when you shift from that polarization that focuses on kind of wicked people, the other side, to kind of the struggle with wicked problems and the underlying tensions. Initially it's a lot of hard work, but there also unleashes a lot of creativity, because it doesn't require creativity when it's a simplistic good versus evil frame. All you need to do is get rid of evil, right? But once you realize that there's multiple underlying values and tensions, and that we all kind of, we all have the same value, we just rank them differently, it changes the conversation in a very productive way sometimes. So you're seeking out that notion of wisdom and judgment. How do we work together to make the best decisions possible based on always unlimited information and based on the lack of a technical solution that's right. But we want solutions that are better. We want solutions that kind of move us forward. So a lot of work on deliberation is now starting to really tap into that notion of creativity and imagination, and how do we do that work. So that's kind of the first part of my presentation is, what's the nature of problems? We're facing wicked problems. And I think almost all, tough issues have a notion of wickedness to it. I tend not to get into the, these are tame problems and these are wicked problems, and wicked problems are a category. I see more wicked problems as a mindset, right? I'm going into problems assuming what are the underlying tensions? What are the underlying values we need to get to? And that automatically kind of sets up my role as a deliberative practitioner to kind of help our community struggle with that. Again, identify those values and those tensions, put them on the table, and help people work through them. So we move now to the second point, which is what kind of communication and engagement processes help us address those problems. And I'm a communication professor. I focus on how do we talk to each other, right? And I will say that this used to say solve those problems, and because of that second key aspect of wicked problems, that you're not solving them, I've been changing kind of my terminology now to more addressing or negotiating or tackling kind of these wicked problems as we go through. So one of the typologies I've kind of used to kind of make sense of this is, three broad ways of how we talk about tough public problems. The adversarial model, the expert model, and the deliberative model. And these aren't completely mutually exclusive, but I do think they help to kind of think broadly about these kind of three things and the pros and cons of each. I will say that the adversarial and the expert are kind of the dominant models. Right? So adversarial, it's people that already have their mind made up and they're mobilizing people, whether we're talking about Democrats and Republicans, or we're talking about activist groups and organized groups that do things. And mainly what they're doing is mobilizing people, right? Trying to convince people of their point of view, using strategic communication to do that. I've done a lot of work when the classes I teach is on social movements, and I teach persuasion, so I have a lot of experience on how groups try to mobilize and persuade people to their point of view. And then the second model is the expert model. And this is where we rely on data, right? We rely on the experts, we rely on scientists. That problems should be solved with good data and those type of things. And then the deliberative perspective, which is obviously the one that I focus on. You see some of the keywords there. I will say when I originally developed this simple typology, probably about 10 years ago, my mindset was more kind of simplistic in terms of adversarial and expert are bad and deliberative is good. What I've learned as I've run these projects and worked in the community in lots of different ways, I really rely on the adversarial and expert models in many ways. And there's a lot of potential positives that come out of those models. So as I've kind of developed my work, I've learned that the deliberative model, the purpose of the deliberative model is to really bring out the best of the other two models and as much as possible mitigate the worst of them. And we'll look at the worst of them here in a while. But we need adversaries. We need those experts. We need their values. We need them to be democratic, right? We need to kind of connect with the people and also to challenge status quo in some important ways. wise. And then we need the experts because we need good information. Our judgments can be much better if they're informed by good decisions as we go through. So really the deliberative is not trying to replace the other two, it's really trying to kind of optimize the other two in important ways. But, and this is probably the bulk of my work the last 20 years, or probably the 10 years before I switched to the deliberative perspective, was focused on how adversarial processes worked, and often how badly they worked. A lot of my work looked at how we talked about tough issues, and I published a lot of papers as a graduate student about how badly we talked about those. And I switched to the deliberative perspective about 10 years ago, thinking, okay, we need to change how we talk about tough issues rather than just lament how badly we talk about them. So these are some of the kind of key points. I could easily spend 30 minutes on this slide, but I just want to touch on a few of these, because this is when we rely too much on the adversarial process. When the dominant voices are always the loudest voices, here are some of the key concerns we have. And if you go back to bigger problems really requiring collaboration and high quality communication, this is the kind of things that we're getting when we rely on adversarial. That's the exact opposite in a lot of ways of high quality communication. Adversarial process often focus on winning versus solving problems, especially in a kind of a political model with a two-party system. They're going to pick the issues that are more advantageous versus picking the issues that are most important that we need to deal with. In a lot of ways, a zero-sum game of kind of good versus bad, or Democrat versus Republican, and the kind of those tensions of adversarial incentivize bad communication. They're going to incentivize the tactics that work versus the tactics that really improve the conversation. I can really say from my 20 years of working on these kind of issues that our political system in a lot of ways rewards bad arguments and punishes good arguments. And that makes it really difficult for us to have the kind of conversations that we need to have. Often focus on blaming versus taking accountability. Blaming works, negative ads work. So attacking the other side rather than really kind of taking accountability and bringing people together is going to be a hallmark of adversarial processes. They often rely on narrow value frames. So going back to the wicked problems, they're going to pick the value that seems most advantageous and frame things around that value. Again, framing it as if the other side rejects that value. Plays into the flaws of human nature. I'll get into a lot more here in a second. That's a lot of the work that I've been doing for the last year. Attracts, privileges, organized, entrenched voices. This is critical, especially at the local level. Who's going to walk up to that microphone at city council? Who's going to write the letter to the editor? Who's going to post on Facebook? Well, typically people that kind of have it figured out or think they have it figured out and see one side of it, right? So you have kind of, I won't quite say the extremes, but people kind of on the ends that really see things through certain lenses are going to be the loudest voices constantly talking. Whereas the people in the middle that see some of the tensions in there, that there's really not a place for them. And a lot of the work that we do with these centers is to provide a place for that. Not only for the place that for people to have blinders on to challenge those blinders, but also to get more of the people in the middle that sees the struggle to really have a voice in this and have a place to struggle with some of those tensions. But a lot of when we have overly adversarial, it creates this negative feedback loop. And your kind of strategic, kind of manipulative tactics justifies their tactics, and then their tactics justify you doing worse tactics. And we kind of have this spiral of cynicism that the research kind of shows. In exciting ways, the deliberative perspective, hopefully kind of creates a virtuous cycle, right? That we kind of change that conversation in a lot of ways. And, a big concern for people that care about democracy, the adversarial model often has a very narrow role for citizens. I do want to jump here for a few minutes, and I do this pretty quickly. This is a current project I'm working on with the Kettering Foundation. But one of the big things I really look at in my work is what do we know about human nature and how people think and how that translates to how we talk about tough issues. And one of my big arguments that I've been making for a while is our dominant processes kind of play into the flaws of human nature. And as much as possible, as we work on deliberative processes, we're trying to design processes to avoid those flaws and also, to activate some more positive aspects of human nature that help us take on tough issues. So kind of a quick kind of tangent here to really kind of show you some of the stuff I've been learning the last year about brain science that helps us to think about deliberative engagement and how we talk about tough issues. So I've been reading books like Particularly Irrational, True Enough, Learning to Live in a Post-Fact Society, Thinking Fast and Slow, which actually won a Nobel Prize. You're Not Smart, and 46 Other Ways You're Deluding Yourself. A Mind of Its Own, How Your Brain Distorts and Deceives. what makes your brain happy and why you should do the opposite. And all these books are doing some of the same things of just looking at how our brains think and how our brains, in a lot of ways, work overtime to make us feel better about our current opinions and not challenge that. And that can certainly be problematic when you recognize the prevalence of wicked problems lots of ways. So some of the key kind of things I've learned that are negative from this research is that our brains crave certainty and consistency. Once we make a decision, we seek out information to support that decision. We really avoid or dismiss or reject information that challenges that in important ways. We're sucklers for the good versus evil narrative. We like that, right? That's a narrative that's powerful, that's ingrained in our brains and in almost all cultures. I often kind of go on this rant about Disney. I've got 3 kids. I've watched lots of Disney movies, and how almost all Disney movies, at least the traditional ones, things are changing a little bit, are framed in terms of good versus evil. And think about the evil characters that you see on here. You know, they're just inherently evil. They just want bad things. They just want power for the sake of power. There's no kind of underlining kind of value that they're really kind of supporting in a way. And I think we're really teaching our kids that, you know, most tough issues are about good versus evil. So therefore, all you have to do is vanquish evil. You know, some people are now making kind of the same argument about Star Wars in some ways, right? So you look at a lot of the most popular movies sometimes just feed us that same narrative. And it's what we crave in our brain, but it also makes it harder for us to deal with real life issues where it's not as simple as good versus evil. We strongly prefer to gather with the like-minded and get together, and the internet makes that so easy to do now to find people that think like you. I mean, we certainly, as we're trying to figure out things, we filter and cherry pick evidence to support our views. And once again, the internet is such a broad suppository of information that you can kind of find evidence kind of for anything in a lot of different ways. And then last, we avoid values, tensions, and tough choices. You know, exactly what the heart of the issues that we're dealing with, our brain's going to avoid that in some ways. It's called cognitive dissonance, right? We don't want to see the tensions. We don't want to see the choices. So our brain's going to filter things to make it seem as if it isn't a choice at all. So the scary news is a lot of what we're doing with deliberation is forcing people to kind of take on some of these things that their brain automatically doesn't want to kind of deal with in important ways. Right? The good news, well, I guess this is a quote that, you know, might be a little too strong with the fools and fanatics, but it's kind of what I was talking about earlier, that you know, the problem with the world is the people that kind of brain science is really affecting are the ones that tend to be the loudest and tend to be kind of the most vocal, whereas those that maybe avoid some of those tensions are the ones that are full of doubts because they're struggling with it. Therefore, they're not going to be as vocal. Right? The good news, though, is there's lots of good stuff about brain science that can really help us. You know, some of the other books that we're reading now is we're inherently social. We're not as individualistic as people assume in a lot of ways. We seek purpose and we seek community. And particularly, you know, doing this work at a local level, you can see that, right? That you can see that you can switch things, and people's tribe can become their city, and some of the other differences that they have can kind of melt away in some ways as they look at. You know, even going back to the classic Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? That we want that self-actualization, that we want a purpose in life, that we want to do important things. We're inherently empathetic. We inherently, lots of research that shows, again, that we care about other people. There's compassion that we can kind of tap into as we think about taking on kind of tough issues. We're inherently pragmatic and creative. If we can unleash that, right? We're problem solvers in lots of different ways. And there's, you know, work now kind of on the concept of flow, that people are their happiest when they're doing hard things well, right? So how do we kind of tap into that as we work on tough issues, and really give people pride on how they take about that? And last week, you know, we could overcome our bad tendencies and build better habits. That there's ways, even though the natural brain wants all those simple things, we can certainly train our brains to do better, and we can put ourselves in situations where we overcome those type of things. And that's exactly what the work that we're doing with the CPD and the Center for Public Life program is kind of how do we start building these better habits, and how do we design things to avoid or overcome these inherent bad tendencies with our brain. But the problem and the challenge in front of us is that, you know, most of our current processes for public engagement really kind of tap into those negative aspects and really kind of unleash those and rarely tap into or nurture the positive. So that, again, is a lot of the work. We're trying to change that dynamic, at least in our local communities where these centers can really have an important impact. Quickly, I'll kind of touch in, when we focus too much on experts, we're always kind of negotiating the role of activists versus the role of experts and the role of kind of deliberative perspectives. So experts in some way are very important. We need good information, but there's also limited in some key ways. Experts by definition are focused on narrow aspect. Experts often focus on being value free in the sense that they don't want, they want things that they can touch and they can count and they can, that are tied to kind of metrics. But a wicked problem, the toughest, all wicked problems have these underlying tensions that you can't really see. And that makes it hard sometimes for expert perspectives. Really dangerous sometimes that an expert perspective can overemphasize what can be measured because that kind of fits the research a little bit better. So looking at all these, and the last few there are really kind of tied to that notion that data doesn't have a strong record in changing behavior, right? So we need the experts to help us make better decisions, but we can't rely on the experts to make the decisions for us. Not only because they don't have the capacity to really kind of struggle with the wicked problems, but also with implementation. The experts make the decision. The public doesn't have ownership of it, and you don't have that adaptive change that we talked about, right? So this is the bottom line of kind of the big picture theory in a sense. The rest of the talk is really going to be now talking about the deliberative alternative to this. But we have serious problems. There's lots of different issues our communities are dealing with. Many of those are wicked problems that have these underlying tensions. They don't have technical solutions. They involve these paradoxes and tensions, competing values. Really dealing with those requires tough conversations and high quality communication. And our two dominant forms of talk, adversarial and expert, just don't work very well. Not only do they not work for those, but they tend to make them counterproductive. Right? But the good news is we know much better ways of how to make tough decisions and how to struggle with these kind of issues. And that's what we're really trying to bring to our community. So you use the term deliberative engagement here. There's lots of different terms for the kind of work that we're doing. There's a lot of different firms, really growing perspective for the last 30 years or so. You see some of those terms there, but all these terms kind of, I think, have at the core some kind of key aspects to it. This is another thing kind of I've used of the interesting thing about the deliberative perspective. It really kind of cuts across the universities in important ways. So you see lots of different kind of disciplines and some of the kind of key words that kind of talk about there. It's also very extradisciplinary. A lot of organizations, I go to fascinating conferences every year of people just kind of coming from all over the place that are all really focused on, realizing we need to change the conversation and we need to kind of really focus on process and we need to focus on how we talk to each other to have better solutions. So I like to show these slides just to kind of get a sense of the field. This is the NIF network that's tied to the Kettering Foundation, the Center for Public Life program. I like this slide because it shows, if you look on here, some are in community colleges, some are in honors program at a university, some are in communication departments like mine, some are in community development tied to extension programs. Really, again, all across the university come important ways. There's organizations like the Kettering Foundation and National Issues Forum, which work together, the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation, which is the broadest kind of umbrella group of this work, and Public Agenda and Everyday Democracy. And the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, has a democratic dialogue program that does this work kind of international. The Public Conversations Project, Reuniting America, and a lot of these are on campuses now. So this is the American Democracy Project, and the Democracy Commitment, and Democracy U, and the Democracy Imperative, and the University Network for Collaborative Governance. These are all organizations that are all kind of from that deliberative perspective in some sense of needing, again, to change the conversation. So my definition of deliberative engagement across kind of these things, some of the kind of key aspects, key components. So I describe it as an approach to public engagement with citizens, not just experts and politicians. So again, we need all three of those worlds coming together, but citizens are deeply involved in public decision making, often working with facilitators or process experts. And what I mean by that is tough conversations that we're not used to having. We have to build up that skill set. So we often rely on facilitators to really help that as we go through, who utilize a variety of deliberative techniques. And there's lots of different ways. We'll kind of touch on a few of those. There's small group processes, large group processes, online processes that take 2 hours, processes that take all day, processes that meet once a week for 6 weeks. So lots of different ways of doing that. That NCDD in particular does a good job of kind of giving a sense of the tools. Citizens come together. They consider relevant facts and values. So yeah, we need good data. We need some background information. We need to rely on experts for those. But we're also going to talk about the values. Right? Too often with tough conversations, people think you can't talk about values. That's a personal thing. That's just an opinion in a way. Well, we live together in communities, and our issues inherently involve competing values. We have to learn to talk about values. We have to kind of get to that point in our communities. And then from multiple points of view. So that's one of the big burdens for us as democratic or deliberative engagement practitioners of to be democratic, we have to kind of make sure multiple points of view, that we don't constrain those options too often, that we're not just going with you know, the dominant voices or you know, the current ways of thinking in some ways, right? So how do we make sure lots of voices are heard throughout? With our process, people listen to each other, and this seems simple, but most public processes are not designed for people to listen. Most public processes are designed to allow people to express themselves. So our process, one of the reasons we do small groups and we try to kind of divide people up, is so we can really create listening, and the facilitators can kind of model that listening. That what I've talked about a lot already is that notion of inherently deliberative engagement is going to focus on the underlying intentions, the tough choices, and the varied consequences, both positive and negative, to really struggle with that, to identify those, put those on the table, and help people work through them, like I said. People are willing to refine and adapt their opinions and interests, and this is kind of key, right? We're not designing processes to try to change people's minds in a certain way, but we're going to design processes and assume they are going to change their mind, because the conversations beforehand are often so fractured and so kind of narrow in a way that when we give people a chance to really see something framed deliberatively versus framed strategically, and we're going to give, you know, we're going to put them at a table with other people that think differently, they're going to refine their opinion. And that's probably one of the most rewarding parts of this work, is you see that happen all the time. You see people have those aha moments. You see people having a real conversation with someone they disagree with for the first time, and recognizing that that person is coming from a good place, right? Maybe not as good as their own, but still coming from a good place. And again, that shift that John Stewart signed, you know, that I still disagree with you, but I'm pretty sure you're not Hitler, is a pretty important move in a community as we deal with kind of tough issues in some ways. So how people refine, we need, you know, deliberation is a learning process. We need our communities to be learning communities. And when we come together, not just to express our opinions in kind of a pitched battle between fixed interests, but to refine our opinions together and to collaborate and to come up with better solutions that we support. And ultimately, and deliberation in particular, distinct from dialogue, deliberation is about making decisions, about trying to reach judgment, right? Try to make choices. Whereas dialogue might be more focused on just really developing some trust and understanding kind of across perspectives. So some key components, a lot of the work that we do kind of tied to that definition. You know, a lot of the work that we do is an overall, how are we framing the issue, right? That we're coming from an impartial perspective to frame the issue for good discussion, rather than frame it strategically for me to kind of have certain values elevated the most and to kind of win people over, mobilize people. So framing things is a wicked problem, bringing multiple approaches, considering a broad range of actors. Most of our events have some sort of discussion guide or background or some information people are reacting to that's often itself built through public process, right? So instead of walking in and saying, hey, what do you think about this issue? We've already done a lot of work on how people think about the issue, and we framed it in a certain way to help people react to that and kind of move forward. It provides a base of information and allows us to kind of have some strategic facts that are critical, but also kind of a way to frame those values in important ways. Safe places to gather. So we're losing these in our community. Right? So a lot of deliberative engagement is about places that people can kind of come together to work. Work as much as possible to have these small, diverse, representative groups that are really kind of working together. And that's one of the biggest challenges of our work that we need to get better and better. Deliberative facilitators. So this is what these Centers for Public Life programs, like the CPD, can really do, is you're training people, right? Whether you're working with faculty or community people, or like me, working primarily with students, but having, you know, someone at every table that can help people have this conversation. That's the purpose to support the process versus to support their perspective can be critical for changing the conversation. One component is we need time, both time to talk, but also time for the results to matter in terms of taking on issues early enough, kind of upstream in a way. You know, we're still trying to figure out what the issue is instead of we're making a choice between a yes or a no kind of policy in a way. So deliberation needs to be earlier in the process. And then lastly, one of the important things, and again, this is where a lot of the work of these centers is to develop connections and develop their network. but connection to some of the big decision makers, right? A lot of the work of the CBD is directly working with the city of Fort Collins, or with the local United Way or the county or school district. But it's important that we're doing the work instead of them, right? Because they need to be one component of the system versus running the system. So the CBD allows the conversation to be structured much more broadly, and for the city to be part of the conversation versus technically running the conversation. So this is the theory. We've just published this. A colleague and I, with the underlining theory of the CBD. So these are the skill sets that a lot of what we'd be doing with the Centers of Public Life program becomes. So the deliberative issue analysis is researching those issues, identifying those values, seeing all the different sides, identifying the stakeholders, and how do you frame the issue kind of in a productive way. Convening is getting the right people in the room, which again is probably the most challenging part of our work, and constantly trying to get better and more representative of the community and more beyond the usual suspects. Then facilitating interactive communication on the bottom is the actual events, the conversations that we spark. And from those conversations, we're getting a lot of unique data that doesn't exist, right? So instead of this individual collection of opinion, we have real conversations of people struggling with tensions and those type of things. So, out of our events, we have lots of data that we're using to kind of make sense of it and how we learn about the issue. And we frame this as a cycle because each time we get together and talk about this, hopefully we've refined the issue, we've understand more, we get a better sense of the data needs that we have to have this conversation. We have a better sense of the values and the tensions and the opportunities and the possibilities. And then we have action in the middle because our events do lead to action, whether that's individual actions or whether it's organizational kind of change, whether that's policy change, whether that's some CBD events have kind of ended out in creations of new coalitions and new nonprofits, things like the Partnership for Age-Friendly Community here in Northern Colorado, that bring people together to think about issues in a different way. But I like that we put action in the middle because it's not a linear process, right? With the wicked problems, you don't solve them, you treat them better. So that cycle is that constant learning process we have in the community. How do we create capacity in our communities to kind of have that constant conversation to deal with kind of tough issues as we go through? Now, I know I've been talking about for a while, and now I've got 15 points. But most of these 15 points are kind of review. I've touched on these. There's an article on my website that kind of has a couple paragraphs for each of these. But these are kind of some of the key aspects to kind of takeaways when you're really thinking about the deliberative perspective. I've already talked a lot about tough choices and tensions and paradox. It's kind of what we started with. Down on the bottom, one of the biggest tensions that we're always going to deal with in democratic society is between the individual interest and the public good. Deliberation is not asking people to give up their individual interests, but they're asking to have that conversation. That conversation about my interests versus the interests of kind of neighbors and some notion of the public good is a conversation democratic communities require to have. How do we build capacity to actually have those conversations? Now, the key aspect of the deliberative perspective is this notion of public judgment and practical wisdom, which is kind of a traditional term. My past work in rhetoric within communication studies really gets at this. But this is one of my favorite graphics to kind of really explain some of this work. It comes from Sam Kaner's Facilitator Guide to Participatory Decision Making, which is a wonderful resource. But he talks about any kind of tough participatory decision really needs to go through these three stages. That you start with divergent thinking. How do you kind of open up and get beyond the familiar opinions and really struggle with lots of different sides? But then once you do that, it's messy. So you have to kind of go through this groan zone and kind of struggle with those. But then at some point you have to come out of that and you have to make decisions and you have to have convergent thinking. You have to prioritize some things. You have to make some tough choices. So really the work of these centers in a lot of ways, kind of you're supporting your community to kind of get through these three stages. And too often we don't go through those stages well. So one of the big obstacles we have when we don't have enough divergent opinion, when we close off conversation too quickly, when we end the meeting because no one likes meetings, and we cut it off and we jump to a decision point. And we think we all agree because we didn't let anyone disagree. Right? We didn't let them in the room, or if they're in the room, we didn't let them talk, or if we let them talk, we didn't listen to them that closely, right? So a lot of the work that these centers do is to avoid false consensus. How do we make a place for dissent? How do we allow people to push back? How do we get beyond the usual suspects in important ways? But what I really like about the Kaner model is this notion that each obstacle we overcome almost creates a new obstacle, right? So if we do the things that we need to do to make sure we have those voices heard, then things get messy. We get into the groan zone, that natural thing. And too often, once we get in the groan zone, we jump into another obstacle or mistake, which is false polarization. we have the mechanisms for lots of voices. We have the mechanisms for people to be part of the process, but we don't have the mechanisms for people to actually talk to each other. And I think this is the dominant kind of model in society. We have city council meetings, we have Facebook, we have letters to the editor, we have all these ways of expressing ourselves. So everyone's talking, but no one's really listening, right? And without these processes to kind of really deal with that. So that's where we end up with false polarization, is we have all the voices that lining up to talk about the kind of tough issue, and then city council makes the decision. But if no one's really kind of done the hard work of really struggling with attention and understanding different sides, everyone who, quote, kind of loses is really frustrated and typically lashes back and mobilizes to undo the decision or to stop the decision or make sure it doesn't work. So that's the hard work of, once we have all the opinions, then we need to make sense of them. We need to make sense of that noise. And that's a big job of these deliberative practitioner organizations, is to try to make sense of the noise and frame things in a productive way so people can have those kind of conversations. And I do really think that working through the groan zone kind of requires small groups, right? Requires kind of hard work. Whereas divergent thinking, we can kind of collect that in lots of different ways through surveys or just observing kind of public comment in lots of different ways. So how do we avoid that false polarization? But then once again, there's still one more obstacle that happens, that we might get through divergent thinking. We have lots of voices, everyone's kind of part of the process. Then we even get to the groan zone and we have these small group discussions and we work through and really see the kind of tensions of the issue. But we can get stuck there. And notice with this one, we never get to the decision point, but we kind of get stuck in the groan zone. But that's because part of, once we start seeing the other sides of issues, once we start seeing the tensions, if we don't have a good process to get out of that, we can get stuck there, right? It's very mobilizing when things are framed as good versus evil, right? You really want to change the world. Once you realize that the wickedness is in the problem versus the people, sometimes you can kind of get stuck, right? And that's where we're really trying to work to tap into the creativity and the innovation and the positive kind of frame of a wicked problem, instead of getting stuck with there isn't a solution, there isn't a right way to do this. I think we have to kind of grasp and kind of embrace that notion of a wicked problem is, of creating a learning community and ongoing and finding better ways of doing things, even though there isn't a right way and there isn't kind of a winner and loser in a sense, right? So once again, to avoid those, we need better processes for that convergent thinking, for that prioritization, for moving from talk to action, which is one of the big challenges of this deliberative work that we're doing, right? So our communities need capacity in all three of these areas, in divergent thinking and working through the groan zone and in convergent thinking, and often kind of lack those resources. Democratic governance, I already kind of talked about, is that deliberative is going to inherently think about things from multiple levels as we kind of go through. One example of this, working particularly with kind of local governments, the old model is the government just kind of informs the citizen. There's now lots of ways to kind of to have government input, and typically one at a time in a microphone or kind of emails. There's sometimes interaction between the government and the citizen, but that can be difficult in lots of different ways. But what we're talking about more is interaction of citizen to citizen, right? And then maybe that kind of goes to government, but also goes kind of cross-sector, right? That's the kind of model of the communication that we need to be having. And that just doesn't happen naturally, right? That requires a mediating institution. It requires organizations that kind of help create these kind of conversations. These next three components I want to touch on quickly: inclusivity and equality, in a term that I've kind of coined called passion and partiality. But it's the notion that while we're impartial to the topic, right? We're not pushing any certain solution to the topic. We are partial in a way. We're partial to democracy, right? And by being partial to small d democracy, that means we care about voices being heard and people being part of a process. We care about equality and who's talking. So I developed the term called passion and partiality to kind of strike that oxymoron in a way, right? That we're impartial, but we're passionate. We care about our community. We care about good process. We care about democracy. We care about kind of taking on these kind of tough problems. So that's the kind of the role of these centers in a way is you're not completely impartial. You're not neutral. You're not detached, right? But your energy and your passion is put into that process in a lot of ways. And that's what's going to create this legitimacy. For us to be able to change these conversations, we need to be seen as legitimate. We need to be kind of trusted as organizations. So we need the impartiality to develop that trust, but we need the kind of passion to actually kind of move the work forward in lots of ways. So I do see these organizations as activist organizations. These students that I train to be facilitators for our events, while they're going to be neutral, I really feel that we're making a huge difference in our community, and we're activists for change in important ways. We're just not predetermining that change, right? We're putting our passion again into the process to kind of move that forward. So that deliberative practitioner is kind of at that nexus of those three worlds in a way, and kind of pushing things forward. The passion, partiality is in particular kind of this tension that we want to be impartial. It's really easy to be impartial because if you don't say anything or do anything, you kind of be impartial. Anytime a facilitator talks, anytime that we've framed an issue, anytime that we bring people together, we're challenging that simplistic kind of notion of partiality. And when particularly we're challenged in two ways: by honoring equality and inclusion, of wanting to make sure voices are heard, and probably working harder to get certain voices there than others because they don't normally come. But by doing that, we're violating a pure form of partiality. But we also want to honor good data. We want to honor good information. We want to recognize. And there's that tension between honoring equality, inclusion, and honoring good data. This tension kind of between democracy and science in important ways that we're going to be constantly struggling with, right? That we want more voices, but we also don't want to say that all voices are equal, equally valid in some ways. All voices are valued, are important, but when we get particularly that convergent thinking, we need to struggle with the quality of argument and decision making, and how do we better balance those values. Some of the exciting things happening in our communities is we really have a lot of growing resources for passion and partiality, of organizations, again, that get it, that realize that we need to change the conversation. A lot of, United Way should be kind of a key resource for a lot of people, that they're changing kind of their model in important ways. Cities are realizing more and more they have to work with the public differently. More and more national organizations and more college centers. It's exactly what the Centers for Public Life program is doing, is really developing these local centers that can be hubs for this kind of work. So inherently, as I talked about this, the role of citizens, government experts, and media kind of adjust. Citizens, instead of just being customers or being taxpayers or being voters or being kind of pawns in a manipulative game, become collaborative problem solvers. That's what we need. They become people that are taking on problems and part of the solution in important ways. Government is still certainly a key player, but not the most important player. They're not the problem solver. They might solve some problems, but they're more of a convener. They're someone that brings people together. They're more of a tool the citizens can use versus kind of a separate kind of thing. The role of experts, we use the phrase kind of experts are on tap, not on top. Right? So they help us make better decisions. They help us frame issues. They help us have better conversations, but we're not deferring to the experts. We're not letting them make the decisions for us because, again, the decisions are value laden. Something experts don't do that well. And the role of media ideally kind of changes. So local media in particular can be a great resource for the deliberative perspective to really help us identify those tensions and struggle with them. Instead of just reporting all the different sides, reporting the connections and the tensions and the interesting questions between the sides becomes a different kind of way of doing that work. So I talked a lot about human nature, but from the very beginning, as I've done this work, I've had a particular faith in human nature. And to be democratic, you have to have a faith in human nature. Though I still realize those quirks of human nature that have always been concerning about wanting to be right and wanting certainty and consistency. But what I talk about here is the faith in human nature is when put in a good situation, humans can do this, right? When given good information and a good environment and a good facilitator, we can have these tough conversations. And I'm excited to report in 9.5 years of doing this, is my faith of human nature has actually grown, right? That even with taking on really tough issues that, people, it might not be, they might not be natural to them to have these conversations, but they realize pretty quickly the importance of these conversations. And they come to me after our events and talking about, we need to do more of this, right? They recognize genuine, true conversation. And I think in a lot of ways that they're yearning for this authentic communication. So good processes, again, tap into the good parts of human nature and try to avoid or overcome kind of some of those simplistic ways. And I think we've seen as we've done this work that it does work, right? Same thing, wisdom of crowd. Both faith of human nature and wisdom crowds are more about potential than kind of inherency, right? So crowds can be great, can bring great wisdom with good process, right? But groups left to their own without good process can lead to very bad decisions, right? So a lot of the work, how do we tap into that wisdom of crowds? How do we help groups work together better by knowing what we know about good process and the co-production of knowledge and creating new things and innovation and those type of things. Right? So that all comes back to this notion of interactive communication, right? A lot of our work, kind of the bottom of the model in a way, we have lots of means of communication. We don't have that many means of interactive communication, of people actually talking to each other or responding to each other or back and forth. So that's the heart of a lot of the work. Some people can do this work online. For us, it really is a face-to-face kind of thing that we need to create these ways of how do we actually go back and have these real conversations. So there's a lot of work. NCDD does a great job. If you just Google Resource Guide for Public Engagement, really gives you a sense of the tools and the models and the ways of kind of doing this work. They have these 4 engagement streams and lots of different specific ways of doing the work within these 4 streams, whether you're exploring a new issue, where you're really taking on a specific conflict, where you have a big decision to make, or you're really just sparking community action in important ways. So there are lots of tools to kind of do this work that we'll be looking at within the program. And then also kind of with the move to action, there's more and more kind of really understanding that move from talk to action. And how do we kind of support that kind of work, and what kind of actions are we thinking about? The deliberative perspective, again, has a very broad kind of notion of what action kind of may be. And then the last point with this is overall, the deliberative perspective is an ideal, that we're striving for this unreachable ideal, that we're never going to have a purely perfect deliberative community. We're never going to have the perfectly representative room. We're never going to frame the issue in the perfect way. I'm never going to train my facilitators to always ask the perfect question and do the perfect paraphrase. But we can constantly get better, right, at those things and learn from each other. And that's where the Center's Public Life program kind of provides the initial training, but also provides a cohort and provides connections and a network that we can constantly kind of learn from each other and get better and better. And how exciting it could be if every college and university in the country has one of these centers that's kind of a constant experiment, a hub of this work, and to really kind of spark a learning community. So now we're to the last question, and this is the shortest, so we'll be done here pretty soon. So now knowing that, okay, we're dealing with wicked problems really call for us to talk to each other in a different way. How can we kind of build capacity to do that, to support those processes? So the CPD's role in Northern Colorado, we serve as this hub for democracy that helping bringing people together to build capacity. I do lots of workshops for the city and for the county, and working with the newspaper, and working a lot with individual nonprofits. So just being a resource for people. I'm a liaison to the field, so constantly people are asking me questions, and I'm sending them articles, and I'm tapped into this broader field that's constantly getting better and constantly kind of remaking itself in some important ways. I'm working to build this community of practice, and not only with me, I rely on students for the facilitation, but I'm also kind of training community people and doing these workshops and kind of moving the conversation forward. And then, the heart of their work is actually running processes, right? Of helping the city, providing. We do this free of charge in some ways, a public service. So we're showing up and providing. I can show up with 30 trained facilitators to help run an event for the city, which would be a significant cost to them if they were hiring an outside firm to be able to do this, right? And just the fact that there's students running these conversations rather than a city employee really, I think, kind of makes it a different conversation and a better conversation in a lot of ways, because my students can really kind of play that impartial role, importantly. Now, going back to the slide I showed earlier of the key components, the CPD is trying to provide a lot of these different components. The cities, communities don't naturally have these, so how do we kind of build them up in a lot of ways? Or like I was saying earlier, with the growing resources, the college and university centers and institutes is the heart of this work. I think I've made the argument in some of my writings of the importance of these local hubs. That yes, we have these national organizations and all these other things, but to have a hub, particularly in a university where you have someone, has research kind of requirements, has teaching requirements, that can kind of really bring all these things together kind of in important ways. And I'll close with this slide of the work of the centers, particularly those that are university or college based, that it really becomes a win-win-win-win for everybody in here, right? The students get great a skill set and get to do really important work and really get to apply a lot of concepts for their other classes to the real world. For faculty, for me, It really helps, it informs my research, and it really helps, gives me a feeling of purpose, right? For being at a land-grant institution, I'm really kind of living out the purpose of my institution of dealing with real problems in the community. The university gets great publicity and really kind of serves its role as a steward of place in important ways in our community, as we're really kind of bringing out. And with the focus on expertise, we can bring that expertise, but also bring this process expertise. And then lastly, the community gets capacity to have the kind of conversations democracy needs that they, again, often don't have naturally, or can be too expensive to kind of hire out in a way, right? So I'll kind of end again with that dream of, what if every single college and university has one of these centers that provides capacity to community, that trains new people, that serves as a hub, and really can bring people together, can serve as this backbone organization for collaborative processes. And that's what we're trying to do with the Centers for Public Life program, and kind of beyond that, and with other organizations, is really changing the way we talk about tough issues in our communities, and providing the capacity to be able to do that. So thank you. I think I'm right around an hour, but you have my email. I'm actually go back to the first page real quick here. It's not letting me. Let me go back all the way to the first page. One more time here. So you have my email on there. You have my website on there. I'll try to post on the comments some of these links as well. So I hopefully this is a start of a conversation in lots of different ways, particularly if you're not involved with the Kettering Centers for Public Life program. And I look forward to meeting some of y'all. Thank you.